Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noire Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing The True History of Paradise. The True History of Paradise by Margaret Cezair-Thompson is, in a sense, tells the history of Jamaica through the lives and experiences of a fictional character and her family. The book opens in 1981 when political violence tore Jamaica apart and created a state of emergency that resulted in many people fleeing the country. Jean Landing is a young woman of mixed heritage from a financially comfortable and politically connected family. Devastated by the violence that now plagues the country, Jean plans to immigrate to America. When her sister dies right as she prepares to leave, the loss of her family member and beloved country causes her to look back over her life, and we also get some insight into the lives of her ancestors. A True History of Paradise starts off with a woman by the name of Jean, who comes from a middle-class family of mixed heritage. She's living in Kingston, Jamaica in the early 1980s, a period during which there was a lot of turmoil on the island because of political conflict. At the time, you had two political parties, which were headed up by Edward Seaga and Norman Manley, politicians of opposing parties who were running for prime minister. So there's a lot of political turmoil because the two candidates campaigned and whatnot, but there was a lot of accompanying violence. It wasn't your typical political campaigning. There was intimidation on both sides, violence on both sides, and pretty much what happened is that the island, or really Kingston, split along party lines. So you would have certain neighborhoods that would be for one political party, and there'd be accompanying graffiti. People would wear colors, so sort of like gangs, right? And so the city split along party lines. At this point, you also had a lot of guns being brought into the country as part of this political warfare. So in the midst of these two parties fighting for power, both sides are sort of arming their own, for lack of a better term, militia, right? Their constituents. So Jean's great-grandfather was a Chinese man, and she's of mixed heritage. Her other ancestors are from other parts, right? She is described as being very dark-skinned but having light eyes. When the turmoil erupts, it becomes clear that things are going to get really bad. And so she decides that she's going to leave the country. She's obtained a passport and is going to travel abroad to America. There's a lot of fighting within the country. Fires are being set, various acts of violence and terrorism, and just mounting tension in the country. She's living in Kingston in a nice neighborhood, not smack dab in the middle of the city, but sort of on the outskirts of town. She lives a rather comfortable life in a nice house. Her family's not exceedingly wealthy, but they're financially comfortable. Yet in the political unrest, it's a period when people are having difficulties, even when they have money, right? So her family is having difficulty obtaining food, resources, things like that, which just, it's adding to the tension and unease on the island, right? The violence doesn't help as people are being killed, kidnapped, robbed, raped, all this kind of stuff, right? It's a lot of activity and a lot of it isn't positive. So she's enlisted the help of some friends to help to get her out of the country. She kind of has to hide this from the general public because she comes from a family that's politically connected, right? They are very well known. And so she feels compelled to hide the fact that she's planning to leave the country, somewhat from her family, but also from people that might know her or know her family in passing, right? She's enlisted the help of a friend to help drive her to the other side of the island from which she'll leave the country. Further complicating matters is that on the eve of the day that she plans to leave, she receives word that her sister has passed away. So she has some surviving relatives. Her mother is the most prominent and closest one, and they have a rather uncomfortable relationship. The mom has a very particular idea about how people are to conduct themselves. So the passing of her sister, it upends her plans. This is a sister that some of this she cared for, so obviously she wants to attend the funeral, but given everything that's going on, the traditional observance of funerals can't be carried out. The traditions of leading up to and then following the funeral aren't really options for this time. So it's like they have to scale things back to the point where some things just have to be done away with. And so Jean laments this fact that the turmoil of the times, the changing of these times, all of this unrest, she's lost someone that's dear to her. And even in that, right, it's robbing people of the people that they love, right? They're losing people to violence, but it's also robbing them of the opportunity to properly mourn their loved ones when they pass away, right? As there just isn't time and there aren't resources available for proper observance of their traditions. So it's like this conflict is taking people from you in multiple ways. You can't say goodbye to them. You can't observe and acknowledge the loss as you typically would or as you traditionally would. So in attending her sister's funeral, she thinks back over some moments from her life, looking back to her childhood experiences that she had with her great-grandfather and other ancestors. And in the midst of this, it shows you the ways that her family and then also other people on the island have been impacted. Her mom is stoic isn't the word, but not the most unsettled of people, right? There's been some conflict between the mom and the sister, and they haven't spoken for over 10 years at the time of her sister's death. So, this is still her mother's daughter, and so she feels the loss very strongly, very deeply. She's described as being someone very unemotional, but yet she breaks down at the loss of her daughter during the funeral. It's not written into the book, but I think if you've been estranged from a person for all of these years, especially for it to be a close relation, your child, and they pass away without you having had a chance to mend those fences, to reach out and kind of work things out amongst yourselves. In mourning the loss of that person, I think you'd also end up mourning the loss of opportunity to rebuild that relationship. And so in attending the funeral, it makes Jean miss her sister even more. The first few chapters focus on Jean, who's living in the early 1980s, right? But the book jumps back and forth to some of her ancestors, one of which was someone living in the 1600s during the time when Port Royal was still around. This ancestor, her family is very financially comfortable. They own slaves, and they happen to be traveling during the time of the great earthquake that resulted in the sinking of Port Royal. The earthquake itself caused great devastation to the country, as far as wiping out a part of the country and causing a lot of damage. But the experience in the aftermath, it caused a rift between her parents. It led to her father being consumed with grief and his feelings and whatnot, to the point where it's he was there physically. He was present physically, but emotionally absent. And so it affected the family to the point where, and the mom in particular, to the point where it's she also has her own grief, and they just couldn't mesh anymore. She ended up moving back to England, and Rebecca accompanied her. Eventually, she came to realize that a lot of people in England, that they look down on the white people that live in the colonies. They look down on the colonies themselves. And so a lot of them, having never visited the West Indies, have these preconceived notions about the island. And so they look down on people from Europe who have gone to the island, and it puts a distance between her and other English people. She has a really hard time forming relationships. It results in her being isolated from society and from social relationships. Those early experiences had a tremendous impact on her and how she moves through society, how she interacts with other people. She doesn't easily form bonds or relationships, or really doesn't go out of her way to form them. As people walk away, she loses her husband at an early age. It becomes a catalyst. It provides more encouragement for her to further close herself off from the world. She comes to realize that you have some people in Europe at that time who, whether they're writing books just to write them, telling stories or what have you, they don't know what they're talking about. She realizes from actually living in Jamaica that a lot of these stories are inaccurate, right? They're either completely made up, if not false narratives. And so when the book begins, she describes Jamaica as being a paradise, the grounds of her home, the place where they live, the beauty of it. But having then gone through this terrible tragedy of the earthquake and its aftermath, she's seen bad things as well. Slaves being whipped, the devastation of the earthquake, the experiences that she had with her parents afterwards. Now in England, she tries to relay this to family members as a way of connecting with them, sharing her experiences, but pretty much they wouldn't believe the things that she was telling them, right? And so they rather believed accounts that they'd heard that kind of confirmed their beliefs. And so being unable to connect with people because her experiences are a part of her, right? And so being able to connect with people about these experiences would have been important, but being unable to speak to them about these experiences, it further contributed to her being distant from them, which effectively results in her walling herself off from people. Jean functions as the anchor throughout the book. So at some points, it jumps back and forth in time. It goes back into time to some of her ancestors, to moments from their lives. But she's the most consistent character throughout the book. And what you have is that through her life, and then also through the lives of her ancestors, there's a telling of basically the history of Jamaica. So Jean is born in like the 1950s. And through her life, we see Jamaica's more recent history. So from that period up until like the early 1980s, we get a little bit of backstory on her parents. Her mother grew up out in the country with her two sisters, brother, and mom, right? So the mom was kind of poor. And so she wasn't able to provide for them ostentatiously, right? They went to school, they had, different things and whatnot, but they came from a rather mixed background. So, and with that, there's like some colorism at play here, right? As they speak about living within this community where pretty much everyone's poor, but they kind of look down on the other kids. They've had like a change of fortune, right? Like their mother left their father and he seemed like he was doing okay. They've kind of experienced a reversal in fortune where their father seemed to be doing pretty much okay, but in mistreating their mom, she decides to leave him. And this now requires her to be fully responsible or primarily responsible for the children. So the mom works very hard to provide for them. And so with this, while they've experienced a little bit of the good life, they spend much of their childhood growing up rather humbly. Their mom sacrifices to give Monica, which is Jean's mother, like piano lessons and, to kind of provide them with experiences every now and then. She really sacrifices to raise them and to provide them with opportunities. Given their ancestry, they come from a rather mixed background as far as like ethnically speaking. There's definitely a bit of colorism at play here as they're growing up in a community where it's like no one's really rich here, right? Like they're just as poor as the kids around them. But being of mixed ancestry, being fair skinned and things like that, and having this different, let's say, appearance, they kind of look down on the other kids. Not so much their mom, but the children do. Monica and her siblings. And so with that, you definitely get the sense that there's some colorism at play here, right? And it's something that kind of crops up throughout the book. Monica and all of her sisters are described as being rather beautiful. They get older and start moving about in the world on their own. Monica, which would become Jean's mom, meets Roy Landing, who is an eligible bachelor in the country. The two of them get married, they have children, or rather they have Jean. Up to this point, Roy had been a bit of a womanizer, but in having his daughter, it changes him. Not to say that he becomes perfectly innocent, but he dotes on Jean. Jean is his pride and joy, and he thoroughly enjoys being a father. He enjoys taking her around the island. He's a very smart man, very intellectually curious, and he enjoys taking her around the island, teaching her different things about the island. Sort of fostering an appreciation for nature and history, right? He tries to instill in her a sense of Black pride, teaching her not just about Jamaica, but also about different people from Africa, like historical figures from Africa. He makes it a point to take her around Jamaica to point out historical landmarks and to tell her the history of the country about events that occurred in the past. So through Jean's life, we see and come to understand her family, right? Which her oldest sister would be Lana. Her mom had as a teen with an Indian boy. But unfortunately, his family didn't approve of the relationship. So when she became pregnant, the boy's family made it that he had nothing to do with her, that he moved away, which resulted in Monica and Lana being kind of similar to each other in that it's great when things are great, but when the two of them butt heads, it can be absolute war. And so throughout Jean's childhood and even into her adulthood, there's this constant pushing and pulling between the two of them. Monica is difficult. She argues with Roy. She argues with Lorna. To a degree, she argues with Jean. She's a very volatile person. And this is something that Lana inherits from her, right? They both are somewhat selfish as well. And it creates conflict within the household. They're very stubborn. They have their good points, right? Lana, I think more so than Monica, but they also have their bad points, which creates a lot of conflict in the family. During Jean's childhood, Jamaica becomes independent. And so her father takes great pride in this. He explains the situation to her, gets her involved in the celebration of independence and the rest of the family as well. But even with that, there's this kind of push and pull between the mother and father, because the father is more, Roy, this is more forward, right? Progressive. He's about independence, doing away with this imperialism, having black pride, right? Whereas Monica is perfectly fine with the way things are. She thinks the country isn't ready for independence, which I think an argument could be made for that, that maybe things needed to be planned out over a few years and to have more of a transition period. And so with that, they have these two very different ideologies. They belong to different political parties, or at least as they're forming, they kind of go to polar opposite ends. The father's on one side, the mom's on the other, and given their stature within the country, they actually have some clout within these political parties. They're well known on the island. They might not themselves be politicians, but Roy's family owns the largest bakery on the island. They have money. His father had been a Chinese man who started this bakery that's grown quite a bit. So with that, they're financially comfortable. Secondly, they have strong political ties. And Monica, with becoming involved with the bakery, becoming involved with politics, has, if not direct political power, then access to it. And so we see different moments in Jamaican history through Jean's eyes, the first of which is independence. And then secondly, the political unrest of the early 1980s with this very big election. In my opinion, there were already problems brewing in the country, but this election in particular, the two political parties and their leaders resorted to violence, guns, and things like that, bringing that kind of dysfunction into the country, which devastated the nation and had a profound impact on its trajectory, kind of curtailing what it could have been. So this is something that you see with a lot of these former colonies, where they've pretty much been stripped of their resources, given independence, but no real foundation for being successful. There's no real transition period. And with that instability, people that step into political power take advantage of the situation, which just further devastates the country. You get some insight into historical events that occurred in Jamaica, but just further back, right? The first of which was the great earthquake that resulted in Port Royal pretty much being washed out to sea, right? Sinking. That was through her ancestor, Rebecca Landing. And as the book goes on, you have more of these little moments told through the eyes of her ancestors. So it's like she anchors the book, but it jumps back and forth, right? As the story progresses, we see not only moments from Jamaica as the country's history, but moments from Jean's life, her family life as a youngster, as she grows up in this home, this close but also contentious relationship between her mother and older sister, especially once her father passes away. Things kind of happen in her older sister's life and her mother's life that leads to an estrangement between the two of them. And Jean unfortunately gets caught up in between the two. She goes off to boarding school, much like her older sister, and it gives them an opportunity to be away from their mom in a new environment. Jean develops her own friendships, but her mom remains like a looming presence in her life. She develops a friendship with the neighbor from across the street, a young man who I don't think it's really accurate to describe him as an older brother, because I think there's some interest on her part in this young man who's like a teen at that time. His name is Paul. But I think because of the age gap and with them knowing each other as well as they do, it's not exactly reciprocated on his part. So he's more like an older friend. And with that, they develop a relationship of their own. He, comes to find out that he had like some interest in her older sister, as many men do, because she's described as being very beautiful. Monica and Lana have a falling out, which leads to Lana leaving home. And so she starts living this very fast-paced life. In seeing the path that Lana's going down, Monica makes it a point to really hold on to Jean and to try to keep her on the straight and narrow path, right? Being very strict about rules and keeping her out of trouble. But you notice this change in Jamaica. During her childhood, Jamaica seems like a relatively safe place. But with the passing of her father and Lana then leaving home some years later, it's sort of like the breaking up of the family, right? Changing of the family structure. But at the same time that's happening, changes are taking place in Jamaica. Jamaica begins to feel like an unsafe place. As the years progress and she moves into adulthood, so many of the traditions that they share, the sense of being safe at home, having everything open, not having to worry, gives way to violence or the threat of violence. Theft and things like that become more prevalent. She laments a lot of scenes from her life, right? Involve her friends and family members sitting on various people's at various people's homes out in the veranda, having conversations, sharing moments. But as time progresses in the country, one of the noticeable things is that the veranda, which at people's homes had been this gathering place, a place of community, with this lack of feeling secure, people now begin putting up iron bars and gratings on their verandas, where it's like several people mentioned this feeling of, to keep themselves safe, having to lock themselves into their homes, having to put up iron bars on the veranda to feel safe while at home. So it's like, while it was once open, a place of fostering community, it's like people turn more inwards as a means of keeping themselves safe. It not only keeps the bad guys out, but also gets rid of that sense of community, right? It leads to a further fracturing of relationships. So as Jean travels through the country, now making her way to where she's going to leave, she comes face to face with some of the changes in the country, the aggressive presence of the police and military, but also gunmen, right? They drive through the country and it's just all of these signs that times have changed. They pass landmarks that hold a lot of significance, not just in the history of Jamaica, but for her personally, right? Because she'd been there with her father, Paul. Now as an adult passing some of these places for what might be the last time or the last in a very long time, she laments the changes that the country has undergone, that this paradise has so changed, this place of her birth that held so many happy memories or just memorable memories. Like, it's moved very much away from what she knew growing up. It no longer feels safe. It no longer feels like home. But there's also her ancestors, one of which is her mother, sort of concurrently her story unfolds, right? We see her sister and her mother's story as well. In the case of her mother, something that's pointed out is that she has two sisters and a brother. And their mom took them and left their dad, who was doing quite well for himself. He was a terrible husband. She moved to the country where in their youth they somewhat struggled because she didn't have a lot of money. But she felt it was better to do that than to be with this man that was abusive and mistreating her. It's something that you see play out with the kids, especially the one daughter, Monica, whose grandmother was like a white woman and their father was like a black man who seemed to also be of some mixed parentage, right? It kind of sets them apart from the other black people in the community, or they use it as means to set themselves apart, right? And throughout the book, given Jamaica's history of it being a predominantly black country, but you had white people from like Great Britain, so that would be England, Ireland, Scotland and whatnot, in addition to Indian and Chinese people, you have quite a bit of mixing here. So racism is present in the country, but it's different from what we might have here in America, in that it's a colony, right? So the country might be predominantly black, but for a very long time, it was ruled over by a foreign white power. There's the presence of racism. You see the difference in hierarchy between the races as far as economic achievement, social standing, things like that. But because of how society is structured, with it being a colony, it's different from what you have here in America, right? Racism's still there, but the structure and how it presents itself is a little bit different because the white population is far smaller than the black population. But you also have other races such as the Chinese, who within the book, they own a lot of the stores, right? You have some Indian characters who would have been brought over, much like the Chinese would have been indentured servants. Some of them have done quite well for themselves within the book, right? The Chinese are regarded as owning a lot of the local shops. And there's one particular Indian family that's done quite well for themselves. And actually, the son of the family is who Monica becomes pregnant with and, gives birth to Lana. But it's like, you have this thing, obviously the social structure is in part based on people's economic standing. So you have the poor, middle class, but then also your racial background and makeup plays a part, as colorism is something we see here, right? Within Jean's family, she comes from a mixed background on both sides of her family. But in her case, she comes out being quite dark. And there's a lot of contrast made between her and then also in the treatment that, received between her and her sister, right? Lana, who's more obviously mixed. And with her father being Indian, she has these features that are regarded as being the ideal, right? This mixed presentation that people seem to be biased towards. And so a point is brought up during an argument between Monica and one of her sisters, where Monica by this point is, I think, like in her 40s, maybe approaching 50s, right? She's kind of, scrambled her way to where she is now in life because she started out quite poor as a child. Her and her sister, they've kind of figured stuff out and they've improved their standing in life. Their mother still lives back in the country. Their other kids are still in contact with the mom. And not to say that Monica is not, but she doesn't really go out to visit the mom in the country. She's kind of turned her back on this part of her history, right? Where she started this lower economic station in life. So she's made herself proud, right? She hobnobs and rubs shoulders with the social elite in the country. And so with that has kind of distanced herself from the past. It's pointed out that she was a teen mom. And before that, she was just a poor kid growing up out in the country. But her mother made sacrifices to provide her and her siblings with, piano lessons, opportunities, experiences. She became a teen mother and struggled for a while, but her mom continued to support her. And then she met Jean's dad and the two of them got married. She became pregnant, had Jean, and with that had access to Jean's father's, his family, right? Like to work for the family business. And she ended up taking over the business, growing the business, as she's described as being a rather intelligent woman. And so that offered her the opportunity to make more money, but in part marrying into this family allowed her to operate their business, but it also gave her greater social standing in the country, right? She was able to develop more relationships. She takes steps to firmly position herself in the upper reaches of Jamaican social society, becoming a member of the social elite. And this is at a time when things are changing in Jamaica. Independence has come. She's part of that old guard. And so she had no problem being under colonial rule because she established herself in that social order. But now with things changing in the country, where you now have politicians coming into power and people as well talking about Jamaica being independent and not really moving towards socialism, but having more equality, providing more opportunities for people across social classes, across races, she's resistant to that. So we see she kind of represents the old guard. Roy, in a way, was the new guard, but unfortunately he ends up dying. And so we see that she's a very hard woman, a harsh woman. And having come from where she comes from, she seems a little bit embarrassed about her background. And so she's one of these people where, I don't know what the proper term for it would be, but it's like people who come from disadvantaged group and through whatever means they find themselves now as being part of the advantaged group. And it's like because of this insecurity, because of the precariousness of their position, where they started in life, they go extra hard in clinging to the rules, right? The practices of the social groups, because they've sacrificed so much, they've worked so hard to get there. They essentially now become like the gatekeepers. And so Monica kind of serves that purpose here, where she's not really of that social class, right? But through hard work and social engineering, she's managed to move up, to improve her social standing. But it's one of these things where she's now made it, and instead of looking to offer a helping hand to those coming up after her, she kind of sees it as that she had to struggle to get to where she is. And, whatever machinations and whatnot, they should be able to as well. So she's incredibly resistant to change. She dismisses and critiques the pushes that people are making for change, for progress, right? Because so much of her identity is tied up in the old way of doing things. She's resistant to new ideas. It's described that she's a beautiful woman, right? That she had an illness at some point, I think it was chickenpox or something along those lines, that left very faint marks that aren't really visible to anyone else. But she's obsessive about them, right? She religiously applies makeup. And in some ways, I think that kind of reflects her insecurity about where she started out in life, how she got started in life. Where by this point, I'm sure, some of the old guard probably know her background, but for the most part, she's firmly entrenched in Jamaica's upper social class. But her insecurity, it's like she goes extra hard in proving herself and in trying to keep other people out. It's something that's pointed out by her sister during an argument, that she has this shame where it caused her to harden her heart to other people, to have very little in the way of compassion. Lana is younger than she was when she became pregnant, but finds herself in much the same situation, right? She becomes pregnant, and in Monica's case, she became pregnant for a teen around her age, but he was kind of from a family that wouldn't have been welcoming and accepting of her. Lana Lana becomes pregnant, unfortunately, for an older married man. Both of them, it's like the details differ, but the gist is that pretty much both of them are rejected by the men that impregnated them. And they find themselves as teen mothers trying to figure out their situations. Whereas Monica's mother, Mary, continued to support her and didn't turn her back on her. She might have been disappointed, but didn't turn her back on Monica. Monica does the opposite, where she pretty much attempts to exile Lana from the family. She certainly succeeds with exiling her from her life. She sees what people are going through, but she's not at all compassionate towards them. One of her sisters mentions that Monica's become hard, right? She speaks about her ancestors and how hard they had to work. And it's not so much how hard they had to work, right? She speaks about the stock that she came from. Her grandfather having been a doctor, her grandmother having been a Scottish white woman. She takes pride in those things, but completely skips over her mother. Her mother being a regular countrywoman, struggling to survive, struggling to provide for her children, but giving them all that she could and setting them on a path to actually have pretty decent lives. As well as that, her grandfather was a doctor, but he had shortcomings, and her grandmother struggled in Jamaica, right? She tells the story, but the things she focuses on are incredibly telling. It points to what she values and, what she's ashamed of. So her sister points this out, and it's like she's behind the times. She's so caught up in the old way of doing things that she can't see that times are changing, right? She's resistant to that change. It's pretty interesting because you then have Jean, who in her own way laments that things are changing, but not so much because she's resistant to progress, but rather because she sees some of the changes that have taken place and are taking place and recognizes that they're not for the good. She doesn't have a problem with change in and of itself. She has a problem with the desperation within the country, the violence, robbing, killing that's now becoming commonplace in Jamaica. And so she mourns more for the country's innocence rather than this push towards progress or social change, right? She doesn't have a problem with the country changing. It's just that she wishes the country was changing, moving in a positive direction. So you have these two very different ways of seeing things, right? Kind of this contrast of reactions to change and the reality that how people view the world and themselves in it affects how they view change, progress, and the evolution of things. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noire Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.